What is up, baseball fans? Welcome back to the channel for the next episode of Ryan's Ghost. I am your host, Salbo the Stat Guy. Today I wanted to talk about the Hall of Fame. The other day on social media, I saw a chart that compared the careers of Buster Posey and Thurman Munson. And then there was also another thread that compared the careers of Buster Posey and Joe Mauer. And so I started to think, Buster Posey is going to be up for election in the Hall of Fame next year, and does he really have the numbers to be considered a Hall of Famer? He obviously won 3 rings with the San Francisco Giants, so that will definitely kind of help his resume. But looking at his numbers compared to other catchers, guys like Thurman Munson, guys like Joe Mauer, I started to think, as good as Buster Posey was, I don't exactly know if he really was one of the greatest catchers of all time and if he should be voted into the Hall of Fame. I'm sure he'll get a big push next year. But today I wanted to look at some of the numbers, and I wanted to compare him to other catchers, and I also wanted to look at third baseman as well, because currently third basemen are the most underrepresented group in the Hall of Fame. There's only 16 third basemen that are currently in the Hall of Fame, and there's only 20 catchers in the Hall of Fame. So in today's video, I wanted to explore that topic and just kind of compare and contrast some of the players. And as we know, catching is obviously the toughest position in baseball. You have to be really good with the glove. You have to be able to call games. You got to be able to have a good repertoire or a good relationship with your pitchers. You have to be able to frame pitches, block pitches in the dirt, throw runners out. You basically have to know what's going on at all times. And, if you can contribute something with the bat, that's just kind of an added incentive. A lot of times, catchers don't have the longevity that other pitchers have. And so it really is, like I said, the toughest position in baseball. And that is why I think you currently don't have any catcher in the Hall of Fame with 3,000 hits. Ivan Rodriguez came close. He had 2,844. And no catcher has ever hit 500 home runs in their career. The closest was Mike Piazza. He went 427 home runs, 396 as a catcher. And so if we look at some of the other catchers that are currently in the Hall of Fame, a lot of them played way back in the day where most people have no idea who they are. So if I can just mention them real quick, the first guy is a guy called Buck Ewing. He played from 1880 to 1897, and he was voted in by the Old Timers Committee way back in 1939. Interesting thing about Buck Ewing is that he was considered one of the better players of his era, almost considered a superstar. But catching wasn't his primary position. He did play 636 games as a catcher, but he also played 235 in the outfield, 253 at first. He played 51 games at second. He played 127 at third, and he actually played 34 games at shortstop. So he was kind of an all-around player. But from all accounts, from what I've read, he was considered one of the first superstars from way back in the day. The next guy is Roger Bresnahan. He played from 1897 to 1915. He was voted in by the Old Timers Committee back in 1945. His main contribution to baseball was he invented the shin guards, and he said that he just kind of got the idea from the existing shin guards they had in cricket. But he also put padding in the catcher's mask as well, just to kind of make the catching position a little bit safer for players. Rick Farrell played from 1927 to 1947. 1929 to 1947. He was voted in by the Veterans Committee back in 1984. And interesting thing about Rick Farrell is that he had 931 career walks and only 277 strikeouts. Just in 1935 alone, he had 536 plate appearances. He struck out 15 times. 15 strikeouts, that's a slow week for, Kyle Schwarber or Aaron Judge. And this guy had 15 strikeouts the entire season. So I think it also just shows you how different the game was. And, if I had to guess, you don't exactly have pitchers throwing 95 or 100 miles an hour back in the 1930s and 40s. And so I think it definitely was tougher to strike people out if you didn't have a really, really fast fastball. The next guy was Josh Gibson. I think most people have heard of him. He was a great star in the Negro Leagues, considered one of the best hitters of all time. His career batting average was 373, 458 on base, and 718 slugging. He was voted in by the Negro Committee back in 1972, but he passed away when he was only 35 years old. He had some drug and some alcohol issues. Biz Mackey was another Negro League star. He got voted in by the Negro League Committee back in 2006. He played from 1920 to 1947. He had a 328 lifetime average, 390 on base, and 470 slugging. Louis Santop played from 1911 to 1926. He was voted in also by the Negro League Committee back in 2006. And they only have 4 years of his career listed on Baseball Reference, so I guess before then they just didn't have the records for it. But he hit 317, 363 on base, and 451 slugging. And the last guy was Ray Schalk, who played from 1912 to 1929. He was voted by the Veterans Committee back in 1955, and he was basically known for his defense. He led the league in fielding percentage 5 times, led the league in caught stealing percentage 3 times, led catches with double plays, 4 times, 7 times he led the league in most games played as a catcher, 9 times in putouts, twice in assists. So before he got in, though, there were only 4 catches in the Hall of Fame, so I just think it just shows you they wanted to try to get more of the catchers in. So if we look at the remaining 13 catchers currently in the Hall of Fame, there's not a whole lot of surprises. Johnny Bench obviously is there, Yogi Berra, Roy Campanella, Gary Carter, Mickey Cochran, Bill Dickey, Carlton Fisk, Gabby Hartnett, Ernie Lombardi, Joe Mauer, Mike Piazza, Ivan Rodriguez, and Ted Simmons. Excuse me. So as I said, if we look at the career of Joe Mauer, if you look at his numbers compared to some of the Hall of Famers, to me, they just kind of don't stack up. I always thought Joe Mauer was a good player, but I never considered him a great player or like a Hall of Fame player. I don't think pitchers were kind of, shaking in their shoes when Joe Mauer came up. It wasn't like he was going to hit a home run every time up. But he was a good, pure singles hitter. I'll give him that. He always had a high batting average every year. And he obviously won 3 batting titles, playing for the Minnesota Twins. But I think you saw his career kind of tail off. And what I mean by that is back in 2005 to 2010, so in that 6-year period, Joe Mauer's numbers were basically, they definitely were Hall of Fame caliber. In that 6-year period, he averaged 134 games, 82 runs, 163 hits, 32 doubles, 13 home runs, 76 RBIs, and he hit 328, which is pretty incredible. 409 on base and a 478 slugging. But then if you look at the next 8 years, 2011 to 2018, his numbers started to tail off a little bit. He only averaged 128 games, only 64 runs, only 139 hits, only 28 doubles, only 8 home runs, 56 RBIs, and he hit 290 opposed to 328. So it definitely started to slow down a little bit. Like I said, they shifted him to first base in 2014, but that's one of your kind of power positions, first base, and he just wasn't a power hitter. But like I said, he did have 3 batting titles. He did an MVP award in 2009, I believe. But he only had 1 season where he hit more than 20 home runs. He hit 28 homers, like I said, in 2009 when he won the MVP. Never had 100 RBIs in a season. He came close in 2009. He had 96. And so, like I said, when I think of the great catchers of all time, I just don't put Joe Mauer in that category. And so if we break down the numbers a little bit further, if you look at Joe Mauer's numbers compared to other Hall of Fame catchers, I did a chart and I took the numbers as a catcher, so the games that they didn't play first base or they didn't play DH, just as solely as a catcher. And if you look at the 13 players that I listed before, all the Hall of Famers like, Dickey and Carter and Campanella and Cochran, there were 13 of them with Joe Mauer in there. And Joe Mauer was last on the list with games. He only caught 897 games as a catcher. When you compare it to like Ivan Rodriguez, who had over 2,000, or, Gary Carter had over 2,000 as well. Mauer had the fewest hits on that list out of any player. He had the fewest, actually he was tied for 12th. He was 12 out of 13 in doubles with 221. He was last on the list in home runs, and he was last on the list with RBIs. On the flip side, though, he was first in average. Okay, he had the highest average out of all those guys, 328 as a catcher. He was first in second in on-base percentage, and he was tied for 6th in slugging percentage. So his percentages are really good, but like I said, just the raw numbers, it just doesn't compare to some of the Hall of Famers. I mean, Mauer had 91 home runs as a catcher, but guys like Ivan Rodriguez had 304, Bench had 327, Bill Dickey 196 or 198. I mean, even Mickey Cochran, who was a home run hitter, he had 117 home runs, 26 more than Joe Mauer. And like I said, he wasn't always the greatest defensive catcher ever. When people talk Joe Mauer, they don't exactly talk his defense either. So he's basically just kind of a one-dimensional kind of catcher. So if we look at Joe Mauer's numbers compared to some other catchers who are currently not in the Hall of Fame, okay, I found 4 guys that I put him up against. And once again, his catching numbers are less than the other catchers as well. So I looked at Joe Mauer compared to Jorge Posada, Buster Posey, Thurman Munson, and Javi Lopez. And if we look at games played, Mauer is last on that list, only 897 games. Posada had over 1,500, Posey had over 1,000, Munson had over 1,200, Lopez had over 1,300. Mauer had the fewest hits out of all of them, only 1,118. Posada had 1,472. Buster Posey had 1,205. Munson had 1,423. Lopez had 1,404. Mauer had 221 doubles. Posada had 344. Posey 229. Munson 209. Lopez 245. Home runs, Mauer had the fewest, only 91. Posada had 246. Posey had 129. Munson had 105. Lopez had 255. Mauer had the fewest RBIs of the group, only 514. Posada had 954. Posey had 583. Munson had 626, and Lopez had 796. Now, Mauer was obviously first in average. He had 328. Posada only had 279. Posey had 298. Munson had 292, and Lopez had 293. On base percentage was Mauer 409. Posada was 380. Posey 369. Munson 349. Lopez 343. Slugging percentage, Mauer was 481. Posada was 488. Posey 454. Munson 412. Lopez was 504. And so, like I said, if you look at those numbers, I mean, if Mauer got into the Hall of Fame, I think you could make the argument for guys like Jorge Posada and even Javi Lopez, just because their numbers were better than Joe Mauer's. You know, the only thing Mauer really did was he just hit for a higher average, but he never didn't hit for higher, home runs, or he didn't drive in as many runs either. So when Buster Posey's up for eligibility next year, like I said, I think it'll help that he won 3 rings with the Giants. He was a really popular guy, but I just don't know if I would consider him a Hall of Famer. So we'll just have to wait and see what the writers vote next year. Now, if you look at the second position, third baseman, like I said, they're the most underrepresented position in the Baseball Hall of Fame. There's currently only about 16 true third basemen, and obviously a couple of them played from years ago that most people probably never heard of. So we take a look at them real quick. The first guy is someone called Frank Baker, who had the nickname Home Run Baker. He played from 1908 to 1922. He was elected by the Veterans Committee back in 1955. Okay, for his career, he had 307, which in the dead ball era is actually pretty good. 343 on base, 409 slugging. He got his nickname, though, because he led the American League 4 straight years in home runs. But if you look at the number of home runs he hit, he hit 11, led the league. He hit 10, he hit 12, and he hit 9. And so I think that's where he got his nickname from. So not exactly what we think of in today's day and game. We wouldn't call him obviously Home Run Baker if he played in today's game and he hit 12 home runs in a year. The next guy was Jimmy Collins. He played from 1895 to 1908. He was voted in by the Old Timers Committee back in 1945. For his career, he had 294, 343 on base, and 409 slugging. George Kell was a third baseman for the Detroit Tigers who played in the 40s and the 50s from 43 to 57. He was voted by the Veterans Committee in 1983. He had 306 for his career, 367 slugging, 367 on base, and 414 slugging percentage. Freddie Lindstrom played from 1924 to 1936. He was voted in by the Veterans Committee back in 1976. Lindstrom had 311 for his career, 351 on base, 449 slugging. Started his career at the age of 18 and was retired by the age of 30 because of a back injury. Pie Traynor was a third baseman for a long time for the Pittsburgh Pirates from 1920 to 1937. He was voted in by the writers in 1948. He had 320 for his career, 362 on base, and 435 slugging, but he was a really good defensive third baseman as well, so he kind of was good offensively and defensively. And a guy called Deacon White, who played from 1871 to 1890. He was voted in by the Pre-Integration Era Committee in 2013. For his career, 312 batting average, 346 on base, 393 slugging. Now, if we kind of look at some of the contemporary guys, so guys probably people heard of, as far as third basemen go, there's only about 10 of them that right now are currently in the Hall of Fame. Adrian Beltran, who got voted in 2024. Wade Boggs got in 2005. George Brett in 1999. Chipper Jones in 2018. Eddie Matthews in 1978. Paul Molitor was voted in 2004. Brooks Robinson in 1983. Scott Rowland in 2023. Ron Santo in 2012. And, of course, Mike Jack Smith in 1995. So, are there any third basemen that the Hall of Fame committee maybe missed or maybe kind of left out? People mention guys like Buddy Bell, Ken Boyer, Robin Ventura, Darrell Evans, even Ron Say, maybe Aramis Ramirez, any of those guys maybe deserve a second look. But if I had to pick one guy I would think might deserve a second look into the Hall of Fame, I think I'd have to go with Greg Nettles. I think a lot of times Greg Nettles is overlooked as far as the Hall of Fame goes. For his career, Nettles played from, I believe, 1967 or 66 until about 1987, 1988. So he played over 20 years. He had 390 career home runs. He had 1,314 RBIs. But his defense is really, I think, where Nettles shined. He was a great defensive third baseman. I would have to say one of the top 3 defensive third basemen of all time. And so, unfortunately for Greg Nettles, he ended up playing in a career or in an era with Brooks Robinson, who was considered the greatest, defensive third baseman of all time. But if I look at the numbers from, let's say, 1970 to 1975. Okay, Brooks Robinson was about in his mid-30s. You know, he played till he was almost in his 40s, so he played for a long time. And Nettles became pretty much a full-time starter at third base in 1970. But if you look at their numbers from that year, from 70 to 75, Robinson and Nettles basically put up great defensive numbers, but Nettles' numbers were just a little bit better. And I think Robinson kind of lived on his name, because when it came to giving out the Gold Glove, for those 6 straight seasons, Nettles had better numbers, but Brooks Robinson won the Gold Glove every single year from 70 to 75. So I went back and I broke down the numbers from those 6 seasons. And so if we look at Brooks Robinson first, from 70 to 75, he played in 914 games at third base. He handled 2,941 chances with the ball. He had 757 putouts. He had 2,098 assists. He committed 86 errors. He had 191 double plays, and his fielding percentage was .971. So if we compare them to Greg Nettles during that 6-year period, Nettles appeared in 930 games, so 16 more than Brooks Robinson. He handled 3,200 chances, so about 259 more than Brooks Robinson. He had 806 putouts, more than Brooks Robinson. He had 2,274 assists, more than Brooks Robinson. He had 120 errors, obviously more than Brooks Robinson as well. He had more chances. He had 220 double plays, and his fielding percentage was .963. But if we look at 1971 in particular, Nettles set the major league record for third baseman. He had 412 assists, and he also had 54 double plays, another major league record. But he didn't win the Gold Glove. They still gave it to Brooks Robinson, even though Nettles had better numbers. And so that was kind of a recurring theme with Greg Nettles. I mean, he was just as good as Robinson was in the field. And I know he stood out in the World Series. He made some great plays against the Dodgers. And, you know, if we look at a little bit further into the numbers, you know, when Greg Nettles played from 70 to 75, he played with the Cleveland Indians from 70 to 72, and then with the Yankees from 73 to 75. Now, obviously, Robinson played, you know, the whole time with the Baltimore Orioles. So if we look at Brooks Robinson, you know, obviously the Orioles were a great team in the 1970s, okay? He had Mark Belanger playing right next to him at shortstop, and Belanger won 4 Gold Gloves in those 6 seasons. And obviously he had a great pitching staff. Brooks Robinson in 71, Baltimore had 4 20-game winners, you know, Cuellar, McNally, Dobson, and Jim Palmer. You know, they won the AL East, I think, 4 times in that 6-year period. They went to the World Series twice. They won in 1970. So, I mean, he played on a great team, and he had a lot of support, Brooks Robinson, especially when you have a Gold Glover playing next to you in shortstop. So if there's a ball you can't get to, there's a good chance Mark Belanger was going to get to it. So if you look at Nettles in that same period, okay, he did not have the same kind of supporting cast, you could say, as Brooks Robinson did. Okay, from 1970 to 1972, Nettles played with people like Jack Heidemann. Yeah, you know, you never heard of him. I didn't either. Fred Stanley, Frank Duffy, Gene Michael, the former GM of the Yankees, Jim Mason, and Ed Brinkman. Okay, those were the shortstops that played next to Greg Nettles. So I think Nettles pretty much had the range to get to more balls than those guys did, and that's why obviously he would have committed more errors. He had more chances. But he wasn't exactly playing next to stellar shortstops, and obviously his teams didn't make the playoffs during those years. Okay, Baltimore was a better team than Cleveland was and the Yankees was in that time period. And so in 1976, when Brooks Robinson finally started to become a part-time player, and he ended up retiring, I believe, the year after that. In 76, it looks like Nettles would finally break through and win his first Gold Glove. And once again, he got screwed by the writers, and they gave it to a guy named Aurelio Rodriguez, who was the third baseman for the Detroit Tigers in 1976. And so if we look at his numbers compared to Nettles in 1976, Rodriguez played in 128 games at third. Nettles played in 158, so 30 more games. Aurelio had 409 chances. Nettles had 539 putouts. Aurelio had 120. Nettles had 137. Aurelio committed 9 errors. Nettles committed 19. Aurelio had 21 double plays. Nettles had 30. So once again, even when he was clearly the best third baseman in the league, he still didn't win a Gold Glove in 1976. They gave it to somebody else. Now, finally, in 77 and 78, Nettles kind of broke through. He won the Gold Glove both those years. But I think it just shows you that a lot of players sometimes can live on reputation, and sometimes I think writers don't exactly look at the numbers. They just think, oh, well, you know, and there have been cases, I believe, where, you know, Palmeiro got a Golden Glove one year, even though he only played like 20-something games at first base. So I'm not sure really what the writers are thinking. But as far as overlooked third baseman go, I think you could definitely make the argument that Greg Nettles, he had a good bat, he had a good glove. He definitely probably should be in the Hall of Fame. The one thing that kind of hurts him is his batting average. He had a 248 career batting average. But if you look at the 70s, it wasn't like everyone was hitting 300. Pitching kind of dominated. And so he was basically just, as far as average goes, an average hitter. But he made up for it with his defense. He made up for it with his bat. He led the American League in home runs one year. He was just a really good all-around third baseman, and he went out every game and tried to beat the pants off you. He was just a really hard-nosed player, and that's just the way baseball was back then. Now, if we look into the future as far as third basemen go, you might see a couple more guys eventually get elected to the Hall of Fame. In the next 10 years, you're going to have people like Nolan Arenado, who will retire, Manny Machado, Jose Ramirez is having a really good career now with the Cleveland Guardians. Maybe they might reconsider a guy like Evan Longoria. But I think at least you might have some third basemen eventually be added to the Hall of Fame. And as far as catchers go, like I said, we'll see what happens with Buster Posey. Yadier Molina is going to be eligible in a couple of years. He had a really good long career with the St. Louis Cardinals, so we'll see how the voters treat him. But maybe in the future you might see more third basemen and catchers get into the Hall of Fame, but they're just kind of tough positions, and so I think that's why maybe there's not as many as you would think. Well, thanks for watching. Please leave a like, please leave a comment. Let me know what you think. If there are any other guys you think who should be in a Hall of Fame who aren't, or maybe some third basemen or catchers I forgot to mention, and maybe you think they deserve to be in a Hall of Fame. I'm currently working on my 1980 run support research. I have a couple more pictures. I'll throw them in a spreadsheet, and then probably within the next week, I will break down all those pictures just like it did in the 1970s. And then it's on to the 1990s, because that'll be a great year to talk about when you have to put guys like Greg Maddux, Tommy Glavine, Randy Johnson. We really kind of get to see just how good the run support was. And in the 1990s, when offenses exploded, you'll see some really good run support for pitchers. They were getting a lot of runs in support, so it was definitely a little bit easier for them to tack on wins than it was, let's say, in the 70s when offenses weren't very good. Anyway, I'm Salbo the Stat Guy. Thanks for watching.